A specific kind of exhaustion comes from carrying something no one else can see. Before your feet touch the floor each morning, it's already there, this quiet, formless heaviness that has no name, no clear origin, no visible wound. You move through your day with it pressed against your chest. And when people ask if you're okay, you say yes. Because how do you explain a weight that leaves no mark? This is invisible guilt, though not the guilt that comes from something you actually did wrong, not the kind with a clear beginning or a specific moment or a fixable mistake. The guilt that lives in the gaps between your breaths, the kind that whispers you're somehow failing at being human even when you can't point to what you failed at. You should be different, better, more, less, but you can't articulate what or why or for whom. You might carry it while folding laundry, while sitting in traffic, while laughing at a joke, because it doesn't announce itself the way obvious pain does. It simply exists, like the hum of a refrigerator you only notice when everything else goes quiet. What makes this guilt invisible isn't that others can't see it, though they often can't, but that you yourself struggle to name it. The clean narrative of regret doesn't exist here. There's no clear victim, no obvious transgression, no apology that would make it dissolve. Instead, it feels like you're apologizing to the universe itself for the sin of taking up space, for existing in a way that somehow feels wrong even when you're doing everything right. Invisible guilt operates differently than the guilt researchers typically study, and that difference matters more than most people realize. Traditional guilt has an object, which means you feel guilty about something specific. You lied, you hurt someone, you broke a promise. That guilt can be metabolized, processed, resolved through action or amends. But invisible guilt is objectless, floating freely and attaching itself to everything and nothing. You feel guilty for resting, for needing, for wanting, for not wanting enough, for being happy when others aren't, for being sad when you should be grateful, for taking too much, for not being enough. And here's what makes it so insidious. Because you can't point to what caused it, you assume the problem is you. Your entire being becomes the transgression. Not something you did, but something you are. Managing it becomes like managing a chronic condition that has no diagnosis. You get good at smiling through it, becoming excellent at functioning while fragments of yourself are tied up in an invisible courtroom where you're eternally on trial for crimes you can't name. A kind of psychological camouflage develops over time, letting you move through the world appearing fine, capable, even cheerful, while internally you're negotiating with that relentless prosecutor who never rests. The cruelest part is how alone it makes you feel, because when your pain has no visible wound and your struggle leaves no evidence, you begin to doubt your own experience. Maybe I'm overreacting. Maybe I'm too sensitive. Maybe everyone feels this way and I'm just weak for letting it affect me. So you add guilt about the guilt, creating a recursive loop that burrows deeper and becomes the very air you breathe. Millions of people walk through their lives carrying this invisible weight, though the numbers are difficult to measure precisely because the condition itself resists definition. It doesn't fit neatly into diagnostic categories, existing somewhere between anxiety and depression without being quite either one. The spaces between recognized conditions become its home, which means it often goes unacknowledged, untreated, unnamed. But just because something is invisible doesn't mean it isn't real. And just because you can't show someone your wound doesn't mean you're not bleeding. You know it's real because you feel it in your body, that chronic tension in your shoulders, and the tightness in your throat when someone praises you, and the way celebration feels dangerous, like you're getting away with something you shouldn't. You know it's real because you can track its effects, the opportunities you didn't take, the joy you didn't let yourself feel, the smallness you've made yourself into, trying not to be too much, or ask for too much, or need too much. And perhaps most telling, you know it's real because of how much energy it takes to pretend it isn't there. This guilt shapes you in ways both subtle and profound, influencing what you allow yourself to want, who you believe you deserve to become, how much space you permit yourself to occupy in the world. It operates like an invisible hand, gently but persistently pushing you toward a smaller version of yourself, someone who needs less and asks for less and takes up less room and causes less trouble. If you recognize yourself in these words, if something in your chest tightened reading them, you're not alone and you're not broken and you're not imagining it. This weight you carry has a shape, a history, a logic, and more importantly, It has a beginning, which means it can have an end. But first, we need to understand where it comes from. Invisible guilt doesn't appear out of nowhere, but gets taught instead. Usually not through words, because words would make it easier to identify and resist. The transmission happens through atmosphere, through what wasn't said, through the emotional weather of your early life. You learned it the way you learned to breathe, unconsciously and inevitably, as a condition of survival. Perhaps you grew up in a home where love felt conditional, though no one would have called it that. A place where being good wasn't about being yourself, but about being easy. Your parents' stress or sadness or disappointment seemed to hang in the air like smoke, and you learned that your job was to not add to it. Becoming careful meant learning to read the room before you entered it, to measure your needs against everyone else's capacity, to make yourself small enough and quiet enough and good enough that you wouldn't be the reason anything went wrong. In families like this, children become emotional meteorologists who constantly scan for shifts in pressure and changes in temperature. You learned that your existence, your needs, your feelings, your very aliveness was somehow too much. Nobody said it directly, but you could feel it in the way your excitement seemed to drain your mother, and the way your sadness seemed to burden your father, and the way needing anything felt like an imposition. So you learned to need less, to want less, to be less. Some of you learned invisible guilt through the architecture of perfectionism, perhaps from parents who loved you deeply, but whose approval felt like sunlight. Warm and necessary, but only when you stood in exactly the right spot. Love was something you earned through achievement, through being exceptional, through never failing or faltering, or showing the messy, uncertain parts of being human. And because no one can maintain perfection, you've spent your life feeling like you're falling short of some invisible standard, guilty for being ordinarily human. Or maybe your guilt has older roots, passed down like an heirloom you never asked for. Children of immigrants often carry a specific flavour of invisible guilt, the knowledge that your parents sacrificed everything, and their dreams were deferred so yours could exist, and your ordinary struggles feel like ingratitude in the face of what they endured. You watch them work themselves to exhaustion, and your own tired becomes something you're not allowed to feel. Your own wanting becomes greedy. Your own pain becomes small and shameful compared to theirs. Cultural and religious programming can embed guilt so deeply it becomes indistinguishable from your sense of self. Some of you were raised in traditions that taught you your natural impulses were sinful, that pleasure was suspect, that your body was a source of shame, that your worth was always conditional on suppressing who you really were. The guilt didn't come from doing anything wrong, but from being, from having a body and having desires and having a self that wanted things outside the prescribed boundaries. And then there are those whose invisible guilt was born from trauma. Not necessarily dramatic trauma, but the quieter kinds that often go unrecognised. Perhaps you survived something others didn't, or you left a situation that others remain trapped in, or you have more and are more and achieved more than someone you love. And their pain at their own life makes your joy feel like betrayal. Survivor's guilt isn't just for disasters, but can permeate ordinary life. When you're taught that your gain is somehow responsible for someone else's loss. Some of you became the good child in a family system that needed one. Maybe you had a sibling who was struggling with addiction or mental illness or rebellion, and you learned that your role was to be easy, to not add to your parents' burden, to make up for the chaos your sibling created by being twice as good and twice as responsible and twice as invisible in your needs. Feeling guilty for needing anything at all came naturally because needing felt like abandoning your post, like failing at your designated role. The modern world has found new ways to cultivate invisible guilt, and social media has created a strange mirror where you're constantly confronted with what you're not doing and not achieving and not experiencing. Every scroll becomes a catalogue of your insufficiency. You're not travelling enough, creating enough, optimizing enough, succeeding enough, parenting right, eating right, thinking right, feeling right. The comparison is endless, and so the guilt becomes endless too. This ambient sense that you're failing at life simply by living it the way you're living it. For women, invisible guilt often has a specifically gendered quality that starts in girlhood when you're taught that your value lies in your ability to make others comfortable, to anticipate needs, to smooth over tension, to sacrifice your wants for the collective good. Asserting yourself is selfish, boundaries are unkind, saying no makes you difficult. The guilt becomes a tool of social control, something that keeps you accommodating and available and small and non-threatening. For men, it manifests differently, but just as insidiously, through teaching that having emotions is weak and needing support is failure. And your worth is measured entirely by your productivity and provision. You feel guilty for struggling, for not being strong enough, for having the audacity to be human in ways that don't fit the narrow definition of masculinity you were handed. What all these origin stories share is this. Somewhere along the way, you learned that your existence required justification, that your place in the world wasn't inherent, but provisional, that you had to earn the right to be here and to need things, and to take up space and to be imperfect. And because you could never quite do enough to earn that right permanently, the guilt became permanent too. The particular way your guilt was installed matters less than recognizing that it was installed, that it came from somewhere outside you. It isn't an accurate reflection of your worth or your nature, but rather a learned response, a survival mechanism, a set of beliefs about yourself that you absorbed before you had the capacity to question them. You took in these messages when you were too young to examine them, too dependent to resist them, too unformed to know they weren't universal truths. They became the bedrock of your relationship with yourself, so foundational that you've likely never thought to question them until now. But now something in you is questioning. Now you're starting to see the invisible architecture that's been shaping your life from the inside. And in that seeing, the possibility of something different begins to emerge. Inside your mind, there's a courtroom that never closes. The lights never dim. The session never adjourns. You are always on trial, and you are always losing. This is how invisible guilt operates, not as a feeling that comes and goes, but as a permanent psychological structure, a constant background process running beneath your conscious awareness. While you're making coffee, answering emails, laughing at dinner, a part of you is perpetually standing before an invisible judge and perpetually being found wanting. The prosecution never rests, and every small decision becomes evidence. You took that parking spot, which means someone else might have needed it more. You felt irritated with your partner, which makes you selfish. You enjoyed yourself while somewhere in the world people are suffering, which makes you callous. You didn't enjoy yourself, which makes you ungrateful. The case against you is infinite because the crime is existence itself. Neurologically, this pattern creates specific pathways in your brain that weren't there before. The prefrontal cortex, designed for planning and decision-making, becomes hijacked by constant self-monitoring. The amygdala, your threat detection center, learns to perceive your own needs as dangerous. Over time, your brain's default mode network, the neural network active when you're not focused on external tasks, becomes dominated by self-critical rumination. Even your rest isn't restful anymore. What's particularly insidious is how this guilt disguises itself as virtue, telling you it's keeping you humble and making you considerate and ensuring you don't become selfish or careless or cruel. It presents itself as your moral compass, when really it's a malfunction of your moral compass, a system so oversensitized that it triggers alarms constantly and makes it impossible to distinguish actual wrongdoing from the simple fact of being human. You can feel this guilt in your body if you know where to look. It lives in the chronic tension of your shoulders, as if you're always bracing for impact. It manifests in the tightness of your jaw, the shallowness of your breath, the knot in your stomach that appears whenever you're about to do something for yourself. Your body has learned that taking up space is dangerous, that asserting yourself brings punishment, even when the punishment is only the escalation of your internal prosecutor's case against you. Over time, invisible guilt shapes your behavior in recognizable patterns that become almost automatic. You over-apologize, not just for actual mistakes, but for existing in ways that might inconvenience anyone. Sorry becomes your punctuation mark, the verbal tick that precedes nearly everything you say. You apologize for having opinions, for taking time, for having needs, for breathing air that someone else might want to breathe. You become a chronic people pleaser. Not because you're especially kind, but because you're trying to manage a constant internal anxiety about being too much or not enough. Scanning faces obsessively for signs of disappointment or irritation, you stand prepared to contort yourself into whatever shape will make others comfortable. Your boundaries erode because maintaining them feels selfish, and the guilt of self-preservation becomes more painful than the exhaustion of having none. Perhaps most paradoxically, invisible guilt drives self-sabotage in ways that look almost deliberate. Just as you're about to succeed or be happy or get what you want, something in you pulls the emergency brake. Deep down, you don't believe you deserve it, or you do believe you deserve it, which makes you feel even guiltier, like you're getting away with something. And cosmic justice is about to notice and correct the error of your good fortune. So you sabotage it first, maintaining control through self-destruction, proving to yourself and the universe that you know your place. The guilt-shame loop becomes self-perpetuating in a way that's difficult to escape once it starts. You feel guilty about something, real or imagined, significant or trivial. That guilt makes you feel flawed. Feeling flawed becomes shame. Shame is more than guilt because guilt says I did something bad, but shame says I am something bad. And once you cross into shame, you feel guilty for being shameful, for being so broken, for not being able to simply be okay. The loop tightens. This differs from clinical conditions like anxiety disorders or depression, though it often coexists with them in ways that make diagnosis complicated. Anxiety attaches itself to specific fears about the future. Depression flattens affect and motivation. But invisible guilt is more insidious because it doesn't feel like a disorder. It feels like truth. It doesn't announce itself as an illness requiring treatment, but masquerades as self-awareness, as responsibility, as being a good person who holds themselves accountable. That's why it's so hard to recognize and harder still to challenge, because your guilt has convinced you that it's protecting you from becoming someone terrible. It tells you that without it, you'd be selfish, careless, harmful. It presents itself as the thing standing between you and moral corruption. So letting it go feels dangerous, like removing the guardrails on a mountain road, like giving yourself permission to become the worst version of yourself. But here's what your guilt doesn't tell you. Healthy conscience and invisible guilt are not the same thing. Conscience alerts you when you've genuinely harmed someone, when you've violated your actual values, when repair is needed. It's specific, proportional, and leads to constructive action. Invisible guilt is none of these things, being vague and disproportionate, and leading only to more guilt. It doesn't make you more moral, but makes you more paralyzed. Your body knows the difference even when your mind doesn't. Healthy guilt creates discomfort that motivates change and then dissipates. Invisible guilt creates chronic tension that serves no purpose except to keep you small. One is an alert system, the other is a prison you've built inside yourself, where you're both the prisoner and the guard, trapped in a sentence you don't remember receiving for a crime you never committed. And the exhaustion of it, the sheer energetic cost of maintaining this internal courtroom and prosecuting yourself constantly and never resting from the vigilance of self-monitoring. This exhaustion isn't a sign of weakness. It's evidence of just how much effort invisible guilt requires. You're not tired because you're doing life wrong, but because you're doing life while simultaneously running a second invisible life, entirely dedicated to finding yourself guilty of the first one. There are things you can measure, like the money you didn't make and the opportunities you declined and the relationships that could have been. And then there are the things you can't measure, the ones that disappear so gradually you don't notice, until one day you realize you've been living at half volume for so long, you've forgotten what your full voice sounds like. Invisible guilt doesn't just take from you, but fundamentally alters what you allow yourself to reach for. In your relationships, a specific kind of loneliness comes from never letting anyone fully in. You keep parts of yourself hidden, not because they're shameful, but because your guilt tells you they're too much, too needy, too heavy to ask someone else to carry. Skimming the surface of intimacy and never diving deep becomes your default, because diving deep requires you to believe you're worth knowing completely. So people love you, but they love the curated version, the one that's been made palatable, and you're left wondering if they'd still love you if they knew how much space your actual self requires. You become so practiced at anticipating others' needs that you lose track of your own. Your relationships become performances of care where you're perpetually auditioning for the role of someone worth keeping. The terror of disappointing anyone means you disappoint yourself constantly. And then you feel guilty for feeling disappointed. The intimacy you crave remains always just out of reach because intimacy requires presence, and guilt keeps you trapped in your head, in that eternal courtroom, unable to fully arrive anywhere. In your work, invisible guilt manifests as playing small in ways you might not even recognize as self-sabotage. You don't apply for the promotion because who are you to want more? You don't share your ideas because what if they're not good enough? What if you're taking up space that someone more deserving should occupy? You sabotage your own success, not consciously, but through 1,000 small acts of self-diminishment. You undersell yourself, undercharge, overdeliver, and then resent everyone for not seeing your value while simultaneously ensuring they can't. The imposter syndrome isn't separate from your guilt, but is an expression of it. Every achievement feels like you've fooled someone, like you've gotten away with something. So success doesn't feel good, but feels dangerous, like the moment before you're found out. You can't celebrate because celebrating would mean acknowledging you believe you deserve this, and your guilt won't allow that belief. But perhaps the cruelest cost is what invisible guilt does to your capacity for joy. You're always waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the punishment you're sure is coming, for the universe to correct the cosmic error of your happiness. Good things feel borrowed, temporary, unearned, so you can't fully enjoy them. You're there, but you're not there. You're smiling, but you're also monitoring yourself smiling, making sure you're not too happy, not taking more than your share of the world's limited joy. Your pleasure becomes laced with guilt in ways that poison even simple moments. You feel guilty for resting when you could be productive, guilty for eating when others are hungry, guilty for buying something you want when others can't afford what they need, guilty for taking time off and saying no and not being available to everyone who might need you. The guilt doesn't make you more generous or more moral, but just makes you more exhausted and less alive. You start to disappear from your own life, not dramatically, because you still show up and still function and still smile and nod and do what's expected. But the essential you, the one with preferences and boundaries and needs, that version gets smaller and smaller until you're not sure she even exists anymore. You become a collection of should-bes and supposed-tos, a person shaped entirely by external expectations and internal prosecution. And somewhere along the way, the question, what do I actually want, becomes impossible to answer because you've trained yourself so thoroughly not to want. The years accumulate, and with them a growing sense of having missed your own life. Not missed it through any dramatic failure, but through the constant quiet act of making yourself smaller, quieter, less. Through saying yes when you meant no, through accepting less than you deserved because asking for more felt greedy, through dimming your light because shining it felt like taking something from someone else. And your children, if you have them, watch this happening in real time. They learn from your model that love requires self-erasure, that being good means being small, that taking care of others means neglecting yourself. You don't teach them this with words, but with your own invisible guilt, passing it down like a family recipe, and ensuring that the next generation will also carry this weight, also question their right to exist fully, also live in that internal courtroom where they're perpetually on trial. This is what invisible guilt costs. Not just happiness, but presence. Not just success, but the capacity to believe you deserve it. Not just connection, but the vulnerability that makes connection real. It cost you your life. Not all at once, but piece by piece. So gradually you barely notice, until one day you look up and realize you've spent decades being someone you thought you should be instead of someone you are. And the most painful recognition is this. You can't get those years back. You can't relive your 20s without the guilt. Can't undo the opportunities declined. The love not fully accepted, the joy not fully felt. What's lost is lost. But what remains, what's still possible, that story isn't over yet. The work of releasing invisible guilt doesn't begin with forgiveness or letting go, but with something simpler and more radical. Recognition. You have to see it first, have to call it by its name, have to pull it out of the realm of vague feeling and into the clarity of conscious awareness. So start there. Start noticing when the guilt appears, not to judge it or push it away, but simply to observe. You're having coffee with a friend, and suddenly there's that familiar tightness in your chest. You're sitting still on a Sunday afternoon, and the voice starts, "You should be doing something." You receive a compliment, and immediately your mind searches for evidence of why it's undeserved. These moments are doorways, showing you the architecture. Begin to distinguish between your voice and the prosecutor's voice, which takes practice because you've believed the prosecutor is you for so long. But listen carefully, because your actual voice is quieter, softer, more curious. The prosecutor is harsh, absolute, unforgiving. Your voice says, "I'm tired," while the prosecutor says, "You have no right to be tired." Your voice says, "I want this," while the prosecutor says, "Who are you to want that?" Learning to hear the difference is the first act of separation. The first acknowledgement that this guilt isn't an inherent part of you, but something that was installed, something that can be questioned. And then gently begin to question it, not aggressively, because aggression will only create more inner conflict, but with genuine curiosity. When the guilt rises, ask it, "What are you protecting me from? What do you believe will happen if you're not here?" But listen to what it says. Often you'll discover your guilt believes it's keeping you safe. Safe from rejection, and from being too much, and from becoming the kind of person who causes harm. Thank it for trying to protect you, and then gently tell it that you're going to try something different. You're going to try letting yourself take up space without immediately apologizing for it. You're going to try wanting something without justifying why you deserve it. You're going to try resting without earning it first. This will feel wrong, and it should feel wrong because that's how you know you're doing it. Your entire nervous system has been calibrated to the presence of guilt, so its absence will feel like danger. Your body will react as if you're breaking a fundamental law of the universe. Let it happen. Feel the discomfort and do the thing anyway. This is how you teach your body a new truth, that you can survive being unapologetically yourself. The guilt lives in your body, not just your mind, which means releasing it requires somatic work that most people skip. Notice where you hold tension and breathe into those places. When guilt rises, feel where it lands, whether in your chest or your throat or your stomach. Don't try to make it go away, but just acknowledge it. There you are. I see you. Sometimes the act of conscious recognition is enough to loosen its grip. Learn to distinguish between guilt and responsibility, because they're not the same thing even though they feel similar. Responsibility is specific and says, "I hurt someone. I need to make amends." Guilt is diffuse and says, "I'm fundamentally wrong." Responsibility leads to action and resolution. Guilt leads only to more guilt. When you feel guilty, ask, "Is there actually something I need to do here? Is there genuine harm I've caused that needs repair?" If yes, do the repair. If no, the guilt is just noise. Old programming running and serving no purpose except to keep you small. Setting boundaries will feel like violence at first, and every no will trigger a wave of guilt so intense you'll want to take it back immediately. Don't take it back. Sit with the discomfort and remind yourself that boundaries aren't walls, but how you teach people how to love you accurately. They're how you make space for your actual self to exist in your relationships instead of just the version of you that accommodates everyone else. Practice receiving without justifying. Which sounds simple, but might be the hardest thing on this list. When someone gives you something, a compliment or a gift or help, notice your immediate urge to deflect, to minimize, to explain why you don't really deserve it. Instead, try this. Thank you. Just those two words, nothing else. Let yourself receive without making it smaller, without turning it into evidence of your unworthiness. This is revolutionary for people who carry invisible guilt, because receiving without shame is a radical act. You'll need to grieve. And this is important and often overlooked. Releasing guilt means facing what it cost you, the years spent small, the joy deferred, the person you could have been if you'd believed from the beginning that you were allowed to take up space. Let yourself feel that loss and cry for the child who learned to be easy, and the teenager who learned to be invisible, and the adult who learned to need nothing. Grieve for them, because they deserve better. And then comes the hardest part, self-forgiveness. Not for what you've done wrong, because that's the easier forgiveness. But forgiveness for having been human. For having needs and having wanted things, and having taken up space and not being perfect. This forgiveness isn't a single moment, but a practice you return to again and again, maybe for the rest of your life. Some days you'll succeed at this, setting a boundary without apologizing and feeling happy without immediately searching for why you shouldn't, and existing without justification in a way that feels like the most natural thing in the world. Other days the old patterns will return, and you'll catch yourself apologizing for breathing, making yourself small, running the internal courtroom at full capacity. This doesn't mean you failed, but means you're human. And unlearning decades of conditioning isn't linear. There will be people in your life who preferred you with the guilt, who benefited from your smallness and your constant availability and your inability to advocate for yourself. They'll call your boundaries selfish and tell you you've changed, and not for the better. They'll try to guilt you back into your old shape. This is when you'll discover that releasing invisible guilt isn't just an internal process, but a social one, requiring you to tolerate other people's discomfort with your wholeness. Let them be uncomfortable, because their discomfort isn't evidence that you're doing something wrong. It's evidence that you're doing something different. For some of you, this work will require professional support. And that's not a weakness, but wisdom. If your guilt is tied to trauma, if it's accompanied by depression or anxiety that makes functioning difficult, if you've tried to address it on your own and found yourself stuck, therapy isn't an admission of failure. It's an acknowledgement that some wounds need more than self-help to heal. Find someone who understands invisible guilt, who won't minimize it or rush you toward forgiveness before you're ready. And know this, you are not your guilt, and you never were. The guilt was something that happened to you, something you learned, something that was necessary for survival in an environment that couldn't hold your full humanity. But that environment isn't permanent anymore. You're not a child anymore, not dependent on others' approval for survival. You get to choose now, get to decide what you believe about yourself. The liberation isn't about becoming someone new, but about becoming who you were before you learned to be ashamed of it. It's about returning to that original self, the one who wanted without justification and took up space without apology and believed their existence was enough. That self is still there, underneath the years of conditioning and beneath the layers of learned guilt. That self has been waiting, not patiently, because they've been screaming actually, in the language of your exhaustion and your resentment and your quiet misery. They've been trying to get your attention. This is their moment, this is your moment, to finally, after all these years, give yourself permission to exist fully. Not perfectly, and not without making mistakes, or sometimes getting it wrong, but fully, wholly, without the constant internal prosecution, without the eternal courtroom, without the invisible weight that no one else can see, but that you've carried for so long, it started to feel like part of your skeleton. You are allowed to be here, and you were always allowed to be here. The guilt lied to you about that. Everything else follows from finally believing it's true.